We've discovered patterns.
The connection was always there.
This changes everything we thought we knew about human health.
Hello and welcome everyone to Health Revealed. My name is Cory Endrulat. I am joined by Stephanie MoDavis, Scott Gordon, and Leslie Powers. Welcome back to our interview series where we would be sharing with you amazing guests, unique and untold perspectives to shift the current paradigm of health in all the institutions in our world, from the micro to the macro, the individual to the collective. We aspire to connect the mainstream and the alternative, integrating all the various solutions. And we welcome you to participate in this whole project with us. Share your story, your perspectives. We have many resources to share. This is a fully independent project because we care deeply about our world, and we believe that true healing and true freedom is possible. In these interviews, we also want to provide you with practical action steps that you can take in your own life to better your own health. So without further ado, we have a fantastic guest today, Lindsay Koach, a naturopathy practitioner and integrative nutrition health coach specializing in women's thyroid health. She lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I used to be from Pennsylvania, with her husband, Josh, and their children, Sully, Celia, and Brooke. Poppy, their beloved kitty, rounds out the Koach family. Lindsay co-wrote A Peaceful New Year in 2025 with Hope Books. This is a collection of inspiring stories from several women who have overcome various challenges and found pathways to living a life centered on peace. You can find her on Instagram and Facebook at heartspeakhealth and online at heartspeakhealth.com and all various platforms, Heartspeak Health. So thank you so much for being here on the show, and I'll head it over to Stephanie.
I'm going to head it over to Leslie.
All right.
Oh, hello. Well, Lindsay, really happy to have you here. And I'm very excited actually to really hear your story about your own journey and how that inspired you to do the work you're doing, and perhaps even to highlight some of the points about your experience with the medical system along the way, and perhaps how they were attuned to women's health or not, how it informed your work.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really been a journey. So what really started everything for me was when I had my first child. I have 3 children, and when I had my oldest, it was a very traumatic experience. It did not go the way I envisioned it. And what I learned so much, obviously. But basically what happened was I was in a traditional women's practice, an OBGYN practice. There were about 7 doctors who were looking after me throughout my pregnancy. And I did all the classes and I, did all the things. I've always been a pretty good student. And when I actually went into labor and went to the hospital, I walked in, I had a doula, and I had one of those birthing balls, and I was all ready to go. And then one nurse looked at me and she was like, "Oh, you're going to end up having a C-section." And I was like, "Oh, okay." She's like, "Yeah, you're one of those. You're going to come in here and think that, you're going to be using this stuff and it's just not going to happen." So I was met with that immediately. And I'm just like, oh boy, and it just made my heart sink. And from there, it just really went downhill. Unfortunately, I ended up basically, I shouldn't have gone to the hospital when I did. It was a very fear-centered situation where they made me fear my body and fear such a natural, beautiful process. My water had broken and it had just been trickling, but they wanted me to come in right away. And what I learned was that I could have gone like that for days because your body constantly makes new amniotic fluid. But at the time I didn't know that. I was a new mom. So anyway, I had rushed in there and everything was augmented from the get-go. So, I wasn't progressing. And that was because the baby wasn't ready. The water had broken, but I learned later on that, I was actually kind of out of alignment. I had not been seeing a chiropractor. So she felt that a bone or something actually contributed to poking that sac and breaking my water. It was real little though. But anyway, so everything was augmented from the very beginning. They started giving me various drugs to induce the labor to get things going, and I wasn't progressing and nothing was going the way that they wanted it to. So they just continued to go on with their process. And when I finally did go into active labor, my son was crooked because they had basically rushed him down the birth canal. So he wasn't ready, but he was rushed down there and he was crooked. And so when I was pushing, it was doing nothing. He couldn't, his head was like over here. So basically that led to the C-section, and I did have a C-section, and it was a really difficult birth, and thankfully I was able to nurse him, and we did have a great recovery. I didn't have any complications or anything like that, so I was really thankful. But during labor, I had a male doctor, and he was very upset because he had to leave a Penguins hockey game to come to the hospital. And he actually did yell at me. He was yelling at me to shit a brick. That's what he was yelling. And he was, raising his voice, and it was just, my husband was furious and ready to, take action. So yeah, it was horrible. And then after I had my son, and after I went through all of that, obviously I knew that I did not want to have that experience again. And I started to do a lot of research and look into maternal health and OBGYN practices. And I discovered a few things. The first thing that I discovered about that particular practice and that hospital that I didn't realize was that the practice had a very high C-section rate, and the hospital had a 60% C-section rate, which is extremely high. So 6 out of 10 babies were being delivered via C-section. So if I would have known that from the get-go, that was the culture, I would have never gone to that practice. But I had no idea. Again, I had no idea. I chose them out of convenience because at the time it was like on my way home from work, and it was an easy place, and it seemed like a nice place. And, so I had no idea that was the culture. And I learned that, then I started to research C-section, and I was seeing, because this was back in 2013, the C-section rate was climbing. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that doctors love the convenience of it. And they convince women and their families that, oh, it's convenient, we can schedule it. You won't have to worry about spontaneous labor. You'll know exactly when the baby's coming. So once again, that temptation of it's convenient, it's easy, had created this shift. And then on top of that, they make double the money. It was about $14,000 or $15,000 at the time to have him. Whereas when I had my 2 daughters after him, and I had them VBAC, vaginal birth after cesarean, it was about $6,500, $7,000. So it's a money grab. So it has nothing to do with what's best for the mom, what's best for the baby. It's convenient, and it's making us the most money. And so that's where you, again, just like in so many cases with the healthcare system, you start to see that you're just a number. You're just, she's a customer, and we got to get as much money out of her as we can. So, so that started my journey in finding a better practice, finding a better situation. So I did end up linking up with the Midwife Center in Pittsburgh, down in the Strip District. And so I went there, and, women-centered care. They were very optimistic, very hopeful. They said, there was no reason for you to have a C-section. You're perfectly healthy. You can absolutely have a VBAC. We help girls have VBACs all the time. And so that's where I ended up having my daughters. And because of, they are cautious with uterine rupture. If you've had a C-section, a lot of even midwife groups prefer that you have your VBAC in the hospital, just in the event. It's very, very rare. But if there was a uterine rupture, then they would be able to rush you in and, do whatever's necessary. But I had absolutely no problems with the girls. Those births were so redeeming and just so wonderful, and they were totally unmedicated. I didn't even take Tylenol. It was fantastic. It was amazing. So,
Wow.
that's kind of the backstory on that. I don't want to keep talking if you've thought of any
Yeah.
questions.
Well, I guess I just want to share a little bit of my own story with my third daughter. So my first daughter, I was doing a home birth, and her head got jammed in my pelvis. And I in hindsight, I think that it was because the midwife rushed my pushing, and she got jammed, and we weren't able to reposition her in the way her head was. And I ended up having to go to the hospital like in full labor, and ended up with a C-section. But my son, my second, I had a VBAC, and I was in Colorado. Now my third, I wanted to have a VBAC as well. I didn't see why not. But I live in a relatively what they consider a rural area, and for whatever reason, the hospitals up here refused to do VBACs because they couldn't guarantee that the anesthesiologist would be able to get there within a certain amount of time, and they weren't going to invest in that to happen, basically. And so because of that, I was in this tight position, and I was not allowed to go into the hospital to do the VBAC. And the midwife that I was working with she was alienated from the hospital because the hospital locally does not like midwives, and they refuse to work with any midwife. So she was basically like, if you have the baby in my house, which was the plan, and then something goes wrong, I can't go with you to the house. You'll have to go on your own. And I ended up having some weird things. It was just it was a lot of turmoil that was so unnecessary, and was very stressful throughout because of this pushback on what I really wanted. So it's a really big issue, I think. And also the hospital here has a very high cesarean rate. In fact, I ended up with a cesarean in another hospital that I chose, and he called the other hospital a meat market. And he refused to do
Wow.
surgeries there. So it's, yeah. But I guess that's one piece of it, of your story. But then there's another piece of the hypothyroidism and your focus on the thyroid in women. And I wanted to hear that piece as well, and how that might relate to all this.
Yeah, and it does. It does, because basically after I had my oldest, Sully, after that happened with the C-section, I nursed him. We had a wonderful recovery and postpartum period. But there were a couple of things, first of all, I've had challenges with my mother. Our relationship has always been challenging. And there's a lot of things there just with, I love her for where she is, but she hasn't been as interested in, self-improvement, or maybe trying to resolve different childhood traumas or things that have, affected the way that she's handled her relationships. And I learned that as I became an adult and went through my own journey. But, I've learned to love her where she is. But after I had my first child, it was really hard to not have that motherly love and support that I really needed, especially after having that traumatic birth and, just feeling so disappointed and so confused. So there was definitely that energetic side of it. And I felt like that probably contributed to me being, hyper vigilant and just trying to be this perfect mom with my son, with the baby. And I didn't take care of myself in the way that I then did with my girls after that couple of years of kind of, looking at the root causes and going to the Institute for Integrative Nutrition and learning so much about just these small, simple things that we need to do to care for ourselves. But yeah, there was that energetic aspect. And then nutritionally, I was very low in minerals, very low in, my creatinine was very low. I wasn't getting enough protein. So there were a lot of physical nutrition issues and depletion. Whenever my son was, I think he was about a year and a half old, I felt terrible. I couldn't function. I was exhausted all the time, the cold hands and feet. And I felt awful. And so I went to the doctor, and he was like, well, it could be the thyroid. And then I actually had an appointment at the midwife center in the same week. And she kind of reached out and she felt my thyroid and she said, your thyroid's a little swollen. I think there's something going on there. So then that was what led me into the hypothyroidism diagnosis. And then I also found out that I was actually entering menopause. I had no hormones at all. I had nothing. I had a little testosterone, and my body was basically in a state of fight or flight. So, I started out in a conventional setting, if you will, with the diagnosis and being told, I think this is what's happening. And then I went to a hormone center and found out more about the hormonal depletion that I had. And she said, you're going into early menopause. So we really need to reverse this. And basically, she wanted to give me birth control, progesterone cream, and treat everything in that way. It was a little bit more root cause because they were using bioidentical hormones, but not fully. And I wasn't really happy with that. I wanted to get to the root. And so I started to learn more about how different our food is because of our soil depletion. And so nutritionally, we are just very depleted, which then affects our hormones being very depleted. So once I started to put all these things together, I sought the help of a health coach, a holistic health coach who went to IIN. And then he was the one who ultimately introduced me to their program. After I worked with him for a while and started to turn my health around, I was just so inspired to help others. And so that's how I ended up going to IIN. And it was during my time at IIN that I became pregnant with my daughter, Celia. So yeah, it's crazy, but it took me a couple of years to turn around the physical nutrition, to, work on the things with my mom, and my health coach helped me with both of those things. Because as you remember, Kory, at IIN, the primary foods trump the physical foods, so it's all encompassing. And so when I had that awakening and realized how everything was just so connected, then it was, that clarity came, and then I was able to work through everything. And it took time, but my gosh, it was worth it because it totally changed the trajectory of my life. Yeah. I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you if I hadn't had that experience.
Right.
Amazing. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of people, especially in recent years, you saw the pandemic and so many things happen where people are starting to look around, or even just the empty shelves in the grocery store, right? Like now I'm setting up garden initiatives where we're trying to grow food. People are realizing there's not enough food security, not even that they're not even getting enough nutrition. So, there's layers to this. And what you're talking about is systems, which is something we talk a lot about. I know IIN is an institute you mentioned. It was created by a lot of doctors or practitioners who were fed up with the system. And they were like, well, how come the average person doesn't know about nutrition? How come doctors are not sharing with their patients about nutrition? And just this very basic thing, why don't everyday people have that in their hands? Another thing that comes to mind when you're talking about like doing research for yourself and coming to understand what's in your food and what's going on around you. Like this builds sovereignty. This builds like a mental fortitude, I think that's important to look at, because you were touching on trauma and some of the psychological things is something we talk a lot about in our work. And then of course, the C-section, versus the vaginal birth is important in regards to nutrition and the bacteria that a child gets as they go into adulthood. And not necessarily people know that, right? It's a very basic thing. So thank you so much for sharing those stories. I just want to say thank you.
Oh, absolutely.
I have a question for you. First, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Yeah.
I know it's so difficult, but I understand what it's like to have a really profound experience with the healthcare system and then go through that suffering, gain your golden nuggets of wisdom from it, and then be able to turn it around and give back is very, very powerful. I want to touch on just something slightly different based off of what you said, just a little parlay off of what you're saying is I relate to a lot with what you talked about with your mother. And I think that there's so many women who struggle with not having a very supportive mother. Now, whether that's because they didn't have the right support for themselves growing up or whatever it may be, and how that truly impacts a woman growing up and becoming a mature woman of her own. But what really struck me as you were talking about this, you were saying how when you gave birth that you really needed someone who hadn't been very supportive to you to somehow come around and be supportive. And as you were talking, I almost felt like energetically it was an opportunity for your mom to reclaim that which she didn't give to you so well. And it didn't happen. Right. Mm-hmm. So one thing that I'm very interested in is the component of health that revolves around the sacred depletion. And I saw on your website you do a lot of work with the throat chakra, and I'm very invested in that sort of information and that energetic component of helping women to get in touch with not just the aspects of the hypothyroidism, but those internal energetic aspects of learning how to find your voice and learning how to communicate more effectively. And a lot of people who have this mother wound, sometimes it's holding things in and repressing it, or it's the opposite, and then acting out of just being totally consumed and being overwhelmed and acting more rageful and angry. So my question to you is, how did you really deal with the sacred depletion of it, those very deep energetic components of your situation? And what is it that you do? And what do you see in your clients as far as dealing with the issues around the chakra system, the throat chakra?
That's such an awesome question. I appreciate you discussing this because this is huge. And honestly, this has been the most significant thing when it comes to working with other women. In my case, I held back a lot as a child. And then even as I got older, I feel like I was always in a pleasing state because my mom's behaviors were so unpredictable and I never knew what I was walking into. So I was kind of always walking on eggshells and, being the one to please her and keep everything calm. And, so for me, in the situation specifically with her, I did have to find my voice and I had to find a way to communicate with her and express to her how she had hurt me. Because to be honest with you, there were a couple of really traumatic things that she did to me not long after I had my son. And, I feel that what she did is related to some very deep wounds within herself. And so, she hurt me. And I did have to learn how to talk to her about it. And it was crazy because it's like it shouldn't be that hard, but it always was. So finding my voice with her and affirming boundaries and explaining to her, this is my standard, this is what I expect, and this is what I want for us. And if we can't have that, then I'm not going to be able to let you into these parts of my life because you've created so much pain and so much strife. And so when I went through that with my health coach, Fred, and he helped me to design these conversations with her, it was like the blueprint for then helping other women. And I have helped other women who've had that same situation. And it's just amazing how you do attract people who've gone through the same things that you've gone through. It's incredible. And then what was the other part of your question? I lost my train of thought.
That's okay. I think I was just asking about how you dealt with your own sacred depletion. And I think you described that with learning how to find your voice and how to speak to your mom. And then I just was asking about, your use of the chakra system to help women find their voice. And I can imagine that they have things in their immediate surroundings they need to find their voice with. But then also because we have such a dysfunctional medical system, that this also helps them to be empowered to ask the right questions and how to communicate with their healthcare providers.
Exactly, because that's a huge part of it. That was another thing that I had to deal with was I would go in for consultations and ask questions to find out if this doctor was going to be more supportive than the practice I had just been in. So absolutely, I think that's a huge part of it too, with practitioners. But yeah, and the other part of it too, with filling in that, that sacred depletion and fulfilling, the need for expression, also just being creative. And, even whenever I started out coaching, like just writing the blog posts that I did and, just being creative and expressing myself in that way and having that outlet as a younger mom who was just constantly feeling like a machine with feeding and changing. And, you're just like a machine doing all that all the time. And then to have that creative outlet was so important for me. And I know it's been important for others too.
Yeah, it's awesome. One last question, then I'll pass the mic.
Okay.
Part of our work and something else that I really love is to talk about this dynamic between masculine and feminine energy. And it's very interesting because creativity, being part of the second chakra, is a feminine quality. All the even are the feminine and the odd chakras are the masculine. So when a woman is in that state of doing and, being a mother and doing that creativity is so profoundly healing. But one thing I wanted to bring up to you is I have many friends in the medical field. And one of my friends is, he's a director of a surgical center. And at one point he said to me, I am having the hardest time hiring a compassionate gynecologist. He said, you'd think that women in the field of gynecology and obstetrics would be extra compassionate. And he said, I have found some of the most masculinized women in the field of gynecology and obstetrics. And I just think to myself, the nature of the system and how it really devalues the feminine principle in most physicians, it almost seems like the woman who would be dealing with the sacredness of life and that intimate area, it almost would seem right. She has to be that detached from the sacredness of that to be able to survive in such a depleted, dysfunctional system. So part of me fully understands the nature of how the medical system needs so much help. I've had 2 kidney transplants, so I've been through a lot of the things you have in different ways. And but I also understand too that they're under a lot of pressure from the system, and a lot of times they have to conform to just survive in the system itself. So it's a very complicated scenario. So we need it. There's utility for it, but to know that people like you and this movement towards compassionate listening and empathetic work and helping people to find their voice with all of these nuances that we know exist, like trauma work and healing our relationships with our parents and seeing things that we don't see. This is really, I think, the only way forward. So thank you so much for what you do.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
I appreciate it. Those are such great points. And it's funny you mentioned that, because in that practice that I was in originally with my son, I think there were 3 females and 2 of them were very masculine. I could just feel their masculine energy. And it was, I did not feel nurtured. I didn't feel, I didn't feel that connection. So that's interesting.
It's almost like it would be a cognitive dissonance that'd be hard to work with every day. If you were super compassionate to someone else and empathetic and doing your job, you have to also be performing that upon yourself. Or there's cognitive dissonance. Like, why am I giving all this other woman care, but I can get, so there'd be like a battle. So it's like, I have to go hard to survive. And that's all I got, which really sucks, I think, for the women in healthcare. I've worked with a lot of women in healthcare, and man, the rates of depletion and what they have to do to survive is, I really feel for them. So
yeah, and that's another factor too. Just with hypothyroidism is women who are living more heavily in the masculine, and they're in this constant state of fight or flight, and they have that chronic stress that just, it never stops. So everything slows down. I mean, your body is so intelligent, it's just trying to protect you. And okay, we're gonna slow everything down. She's in danger. And so career change is one of the top things that I help people do. Is let's look at what you're doing for work, and let's try to get you out of it completely, or let's bring you home, or but that's always such a huge source of chronic stress and too much masculine energy. So that's interesting.
I have a a clarifying question. You mentioned primary foods and physical foods, and I'd like for you to explain what the difference is between them.
Yeah, sure. So at the Institute for Integrative Nutrition, Josh Rosenthal, who's the founder, he actually has a book, and I believe it's titled Primary Food. But he came up with this concept where the foundation of our nutrition is energetic. And so what you have is your relationships, your career, your spirituality or your faith, and then physical movement. He places physical movement in that category, just because of the connection between us physically moving our body and the energetic effects that it has, not just from a cardio perspective or strength perspective, but the mental and spiritual effects that it can have. So there's those, and then the physical nutrition, just, the food that we have to eat. And it's funny when you look at how much, changing what you're eating and eating better foods provides you with clarity and kind of, opens up that gateway into having more mental and spiritual clarity. And just the way that ping pongs is amazing. So much of our diet seems to calcify the pineal gland, and there's just all of that's crazy.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's an assault on the thyroid as well, the American diet and the bread and the bromides, things like
Yes.
that. Lindsay, I wanted to let you know that I really resonated with your opening story about your first birth. It was 40 years ago that my wife at the time and I had my only daughter. And there was no internet in those days. We would have loved to have signed up for midwife services. We were going to do as natural as we could under the circumstances. And so we were enrolled in birth classes at the hospital, and we attended the birth classes faithfully, learned how to breathe. Our goal was to try to get through the birth without resorting to anesthesia. But when we walked into the room with the doctor wasn't on board with the classes that we did. All that gave me was the right to be present. At that time, it was very, not men couldn't go in with the women most of the time. This is a progressive hospital, it's a new program. That's why we had the classes. So there I was witnessing him browbeating her into trying to get her to take the anesthesia anyway. They had the anesthesia wagon right outside the door. You could see every time the door opened. And his attitude was extremely sarcastic, and he just scoffed at the idea that we were going to try to do this. And he began to, with his actions and behaviors, begin to drive a wedge between us to the point where we ended up having to compromise and say, okay, let's get an epidural. And the happy ending to the story is my daughter came in. It was a very spiritual experience for me. There was no crying. There was no upset on the part of my daughter. She actually, highly unusual, I'm told, was able to focus her eyes and grab at my finger when the doctor wasn't looking. I had my finger there. And it was amazing experience to me, and it changed my life. So I think those experiences should be life-changing and should be, we were talking about the sexes of the masculine and feminine. All throughout history, it's been women helping women give birth. And the idea that a doctor would go in and deliver babies that had no empathy, I don't have a problem with males delivering babies. I do have a problem with males that are completely out of touch with women and women's needs, or with couples or with babies, and that just can act like that. So I hope that's being phased out, but I know it's not. So what I wanted to ask you is if you had any observations you wanted to share about attitudes towards babies once they're born. Did you experience anything like pressures for shots or other invasive medical treatments? How were the babies treated? Is that a factor as well? And do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, you know what? Whenever I had him, they were very much, you know, we're going to do the shots now. And at that point, I was not aware with the vaccines. That came along a little bit later. But yeah, I ended up vaccinating him. And when he was 2, I had started to read some books about that because my eyes were just being opened to so many different things. And I did decide at that point that I was done. When he was 2, I actually didn't vaccinate my daughters. So with my first daughter, with my second child, that was where I saw the pushback because I had been going to the same pediatrician that I'd taken my son to, and they told me, if you don't take the shots, if you don't give her the shots, then you're done. You're going to have to find another practice. And so we did. We did. So it was, it's incredible, just the uncovering of everything that happened so quickly for me. But I can just say that with the midwife group at that time, they were not as forceful or pressuring. You know, they just kind of gently asked me, you know, have you thought about what you want to do with the vaccines? And I told them, and they said, okay. And even though we were in the hospital, there were no issues. You know, so it's, you really just have to research your provider and know what you're walking into with their culture and with what they expect. And yeah, that's everything.
Wow.
Wow. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank
Can,
you.
can you share a little bit about what your like assessment looks like with your clients and how you decide upon a treatment plan for them?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's an intake form that actually IIN provided for us. They gave us one for women, for men, for children, teens, elderly, and it's been a really helpful tool because basically what I do is I have people answer questions based on their childhood because there's the belief of the first 10 years of our life is our constitution. And so what happens in that first 10 years with nutrition, you know, with your primary foods, your relationships, all the things, you know, influences so much because we are essentially built pretty quickly in that first 10 years of our lives. So childhood is looked at. There's questions about food, there's questions about relationships, and then it goes into what's life like now? You know, what are you eating now? What's your work like? Relationships, physical movement. It's very simple, but yet it's powerful because we're looking at the whole person from the time that they were a child until now. Another thing that I ask people is what their blood type is, because blood type is it's kind of like a, you know, a key that can unlock a lot of mysteries that people live with, because different blood types thrive on different foods or thrive on different exercises. You know, I had a girl one time who she was doing really intense exercise, and that was actually jacking up her cortisol, putting her in that very stressed state and contributing to her slow thyroid. So blood type's another good thing, good indicator. But that's basically it. But we always start with the food and the nutrition and the exercise. And then once we build that trust, we start talking about the deeper things. And then you start to get a better understanding of what's going on. So
Yeah.
lots of career stuff, lots of relationship stuff, lots of holding back, not expressing, not having the meaningful conversations that need to be had to break down those barriers and start to come up with solutions. So
Yeah.
mhm.
Lindsay, I remember one of the first clients I had, I like made cry and I was like, oh my gosh, this is how powerful this stuff is. I'm like just asking really high mileage questions and getting people thinking about things they never considered before. I was like, my goodness, you know, and it was profound for both them and for me because, you know, as a health coach, you learn in that process of mirroring, is what they call it, right? So it's absolutely incredible. And if you don't mind, I have a question among these lines, since that school was created as an alternative type of system to the system we have here in America. And a lot of people right now are talking about current systems in America, changing the food pyramid, changing, just basically all sorts of different health metrics. And I meet naturopathic doctors and they're like, the numbers are always wrong. And then they're under attack. And then other people are like, well, they're not, real medicine. And there's all this stuff going on. So how do you navigate that with, your clients? And do you think there's any particular change that needs to take place within the systems, from your point of view?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would have to say the biggest thing that I hear is that, and I work with women, and their biggest complaint is that they just don't feel heard or understood when they're in the appointment that they're in with their doctor. It's very rushed. It's very like, here's the cookie cut solution. This is what I can give you. Don't worry about the other things. No, that's just hogwash. That's just a myth. This is the real thing, and then they leave and it's like they feel like they haven't even shared anything that's going on. They just feel very pushed off, so I don't know. I feel like, to be honest with you, I think every doctor's office should have a health coach or have two health coaches that can do that part of the job that maybe they don't want to do, and just give that extra insight into what's going on, because, we have to integrate both systems first, right? Like, we have to come together somehow. I think that would be a great first step.
Lindsay,
Yeah.
Part of my program with Awakening Healthcare was to integrate kidney coaches, people who've had the lived experience of going through a kidney transplant, onto an actual transplant team, which made perfectly good sense, totally logical. Everybody agreed that it needed to be done, but we had a lot of barriers with this relationship and integration. And the first question was, who's going to pay for them?
Yeah.
Right. So it's, in my field, if you're dealing with somebody with chronic illness who's on dialysis waiting for a transplant, usually they're very depleted of resources unless it's somebody who's independently wealthy. So part of my work was always like, how can I ask this person for money? Because I've been in their shoes and they're barely surviving. So it's one of those things, like you said, integration needs to happen, but there needs to be some sort of financial structure.
Yes.
So, I mean, people like you and I who have the lived experience, I mean, I'm a 2-time transplant patient, so I don't have the means to just do all of my work for free at this point.
Right.
So it's one of those things where it's like, how do we start to value the person who's had the actual subjective experience to be able to help the person who's newly diagnosed? And back to that masculine feminine perspective, is that in the Western medical model, it is very much objective and logos related. It's like, how do we fix this problem? Right. So my whole point of starting my nonprofit that I had was, we need to integrate the feminine perspective back into the healthcare model. And when I went to do that with the patients, what I realized, as you did, and as we all know here on this panel, is that the doctors needed all that work too. So so the implementation process, I think we have plenty of health coaches and plenty of people who could be of such great service to patients.
Right.
But how we need to focus on some sort, are we going to work together or not? And I think that's the biggest barrier we face. Do you have any suggestions on anything you faced with these sorts of barriers, or any suggestions you may have?
I mean, I just know that a lot of this goes back to the insurance companies. They basically control everything, as far as the integration goes. And actually, my family and I, we are part of Christian healthcare ministries. We don't have traditional insurance. So we put so much money basically into a big pot, every month with a bunch of people. And then if something comes up, you submit your receipts and you get reimbursed. And I feel like if we could move toward more of that without all the stipulations and all the control and all the red tape,
right,
that's where you could start to see some wiggle room to make those changes. Because if you would have a practice, let's say just a PCP group who's like, yeah, you know what, we're interested in having some health coaches come in and kind of do that back end work where you're digging a little bit more and talking to them about simple changes, ultimately it helps everyone. But they would have to, like, that practice would have to kind of shift into using more of that type of insurance where you're getting away from all the regulation and everything. I feel like that's probably one of the biggest things that could help make the shift, but how many of those exist? I mean, I know of Christian healthcare ministries. I don't know. There is something else I recently heard of. And then I think Josh Rosenthal.
Crowd health is another one that puts into like you said, they put it into a repository and then they get money back. So I think they're happening. These independent insurance companies are happening. And I think they're working really well so far.
Yeah.
But to get it into the hospital or to the majority of traditional practices, it's just impossible. So I mean, even if we created relationships where providers knew their local health coaches or did a little bit of research, or if health coaches went out to their local centers and said, here, I offer these services. If your client, can pay for it, or you can have some donation-based stuff, maybe it's our job as the coaches or the outliers of the system to just go hand out information, Otherwise, we're separate. And we lose so much potential to help people who are suffering within the system. I mean, I found in my end, I'm not getting people until the situation is very dramatic. And I was like, if we would have just been talking sooner, this all wouldn't have happened.
Exactly. I've had that same exact thing. Because I've had women who, they were having symptoms, and then like a couple years goes by and a couple of them then developed breast cancer. A couple other ones had nodules, and they reached out to me, I would like to meet with you. But then what happens is they have all of their instruction and all their medication from the doctor, and they're afraid to make dietary changes. They're afraid to take supplements. They're afraid, to do the things that would help. And so it doesn't work.
What are those early symptoms and the red flags that you would ask women to look out for and seek help early?
So the big thing is high estrogen. So they go to get blood work because they're not feeling well. As in, fatigue, sore breasts, periods are either like getting close together or they're getting, really far apart and kind of alternating. Usually they are getting closer together. Nodules forming or growths forming on the thyroid or in the reproductive system or just, on the breasts. Migraines, all of those types of things. And so a lot of it really, again, goes back to mineral depletion because they are stressed. They have chronic stress. And when we're stressed, we suck down minerals. We suck down a lot of magnesium and we burn through iodine and that type of, those things. So, they try to take care of it themselves. And then time passes and, they get stuck back on that wheel and the hamster wheel. And then pretty soon it's an early stage breast cancer. And then at that point, it's like, okay, I've really got to change my life, but when they get sucked into that conventional way of dealing with it, it's really hard for them to implement what I want them to because there's all these stipulations. It could even be something like, well, if you're taking this medication, we don't want you to eat these certain foods, or we don't want you to take these certain vitamins or supplements. And it's a battle.
There's a story locally here of a health practitioner who was not mainstream, right? And I think he was somewhat direct with some of his patients about deterring them from doing chemo. And somebody turned him in, and they actually set him up with someone going in and pretending they had an issue. And they caught him saying something that they considered outside his scope or inappropriate, not, giving medical advice that he shouldn't have given. And he ended up being jailed and losing his whole practice.
Wow.
Oh
Crazy.
my gosh. That's
So,
terrible.
yeah, you mentioned mineral depletions, sort of maybe on the nutritional side, and you also mentioned relationships being on more of the primary food side. So would you say those are like the two main things? Like, is there anything else nutritionally that may have to be looked at when it comes to the thyroid that you notice as like a reoccurring theme?
Hmm. Well, so was it Scott, I think, that was talking about the baked goods, the bread,
Hmm.
all of those wheat products, the flour, and the brominated flour. So there's the bromides and different types of halogens that block the absorption of iodine in the body. So a lot of our diet, a lot of our food system has all this conventional GMO, glyphosate saturated wheat, which is horrible alone, but then it's also blocking iodine. Even, fluoride does this, chlorine in the swimming pool. In the summertime, if you're in the pool a lot, that chlorine can block your absorption of iodine. So, just these little details can make such a huge impact. So there's that. The magnesium is responsible for over 300, 500 processes in the body, I think they say now. And that tends to be depleted by things like caffeine, the stress, like we talked about. So getting away from the I should call it the industrialized diet or food system, kind of going off of that, either making your own breads or buying organic sourdough or Ezekiel 4-9 bread or whatever you prefer to do, but just getting away from that in itself, just the wheat products is huge, because it allows the body to be better at absorbing the minerals, and getting your foods locally, like a local organic farm. There's a website called Farm Match, and you can put your zip code in and find a farm that delivers. They'll deliver to your door. There's a lot of farms that are in these programs where they will deliver to your door, and it's, regenerative soil that their food is being grown in, and they offer other products. We're very blessed. We have a local organic farm not far from us. Our friends
Nice.
have raw milk, honey, maple syrup. They have produce, they have meat. So hooking up with something like that to provide your mainstay of food and get that mineral rich food back into your diet, it's huge. I actually, whenever I started my whole journey with food, I found a farm in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and they deliver right now. I think they have like 75 drop off points where they will come into a parking lot. So that was one of the first things I did, because they came to the Lowe's in Cranberry Township and they put out coolers and they put out everybody's orders.
Wow.
You bring your cooler, load your cooler up, you check in with them, give them your name, because you do it all online.
Hmm.
And it was amazing. And I mean, they still exist, and there's other farms that are doing this. You can get your raw milk and your all the produce, the meat, eggs. It's amazing. So I mean, that alone changed my blood, changed
Yeah.
everything,
Yeah. Pennsylvania, we used to get it. My family would get glass bottles of raw milk delivered right to our door. It's like we had the milkman,
Yeah.
from the Amish. It was incredible. Down
Yeah.
here in Florida, it's actually considered illegal to drink raw milk, and it's for pet consumption only. So, if you don't mind, maybe my closing question, a lot of what we talk about in our project has to deal with the psychology of authoritarianism and statism, sort of the government's influence on our health. And what have you observed maybe when it comes to this subject? I feel like it doesn't necessarily get enough attention, maybe because people are afraid to speak up about it. But considering the fact that you went through this whole experience and you saw the system and you're really questioning things, what do you think about the government's role and impact on health and in relation to some of these subjects like raw milk?
Oh my goodness, it's crazy. I feel like God prepared me, because I started my journey, I think it was like the fall of 2014. So by the time COVID came, I mean, I just knew my instincts were like, nope, this is evil. The things that they were wanting us to do made absolutely no sense. It was the opposite of what you should do to boost your immune system. And, it was crazy. So that was kind of like I realized there was corruption. And then when that started, I was like, okay, like, this is really serious, you know? So then that led me to researching even more just about all the underpinnings in our food system. And yeah, it's just, it's very corrupt. And there just is a constant need and a constant thirst for control. And, you know, I think that we're at a point where if you're not connected with a local farm to get your food, or growing your own food, or doing both, you need to be. It's 2026. You either need to be tied in with a local farm or be growing your own food, because I question, even at the store, you know, something says it's organic. How do I know it's organic? And we had the things with the food coverings, the wax, the stuff they were putting on it. You know, it's just, you hate to be paranoid or feel like you're being paranoid, but it's very difficult to trust anything because everyone is connected and everyone seems to be serving the same small group of people. So, you know, and the healthier that you get, the more awake you become to all of that. So I just think it's incredibly important to focus on being more self-sustaining than anything else, because I mean, honestly, I have no faith in anyone at this point. I just don't. I've come full circle. I thought maybe there was a chance for change in certain areas, but I mean, we've seen some little improvements. I mean, there have been improvements, but as a whole, I just right now don't really trust anyone. I don't know how you guys feel, but that's where I'm at.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. And it's been so great just hearing, your perspective on this. And again, we encourage our audience, if they disagree, they can share their views with us as well. We're open to hearing different perspectives on this matter. We know, it was considered a controversial subject in past years. And it's something that many people may just want to push under the rug and say, well, we're done with that. But like, if we look at that time era, it was pretty crazy with all the things that were being shared and all the hysteria around, do I do this? Do I not do that? I know I was actually one of the first people talking about it on local TV, and they were looking at me like, what do you mean there's something coming from China? I was warning them before they started warning the whole world. And that was a very interesting dynamic, because when they started warning the whole world, I was like, maybe we are warning too much, and like we can take things to an extreme. Where we do get perhaps paranoid, and then people who question things are the ones being called paranoid, and it's like, I don't know, right? Very interesting. But it's part of the reason why we're trying to do our work is to question maybe those underlying belief systems that we have, where it's like, are we taking control of our own health? Or is someone else taking control of our own health for us? And I think that's maybe full circle where a lot of what I hear in your story, comes down to. It's like you took health into your own hands. And I think we would encourage anybody listening to this to do the same thing and to help other people do the same thing. And that's why I'm also trying to set up systems. And Stephanie's got her nonprofit, and I'm trying to set up a nonprofit. And we're trying to build systems that will help sustain that message.
Yeah. I think that's a wonderful thing. It's needed at this point in time, because, there's other things that are appearing to come down the pipeline, just with a possible surveillance state/social credit system, with digital currency being the mainframe, and just, a lot more of what we're doing being under the microscope, how we're behaving, and what are we buying and what are we doing. And so that's why I just think educating yourself, educating your children, helping them understand how simply your body is so intelligent. It is so amazing. It knows how to heal, but like we learned, you have to give it half the chance. So if someone isn't interested, let's say they think, I don't have the money to be buying food from a local organic farm. They might go on and say, that's too expensive for me. Then my advice is, when you're going to the store and you're buying produce, if you're just getting conventional produce, for instance, put it in a bath of water with baking soda, like a teaspoon of baking soda for 3 minutes. Let it soak, rinse it off. That baking soda will remove the pesticides and anything else that's on it. You know, there's little things like that that you can do each time you go to the store and you're washing your produce. I mean, that helps you on a cellular level. You know, that's just something small that you can do. But the bottom line is we have to take control. We can't just think, well, you know, and kick the can and think, well, you know, the doctor will help me out. Unfortunately, I mean, there is a time and place for that system, but the big picture is that for your normal everyday life and for you to feel your absolute best, it has to be up to you. So,
Thank you so much. I think that's a good way to conclude this whole interview. And Stephanie and Scott, if you have any final remarks to make.
No, thank you so much for your wonderful discussion.
Oh, thank you.
I think I just want to say that I think that the WEF has already admitted part of the COVID error was about testing the public's willingness to comply. So I think that you're right. If we want a new system or we want to do alternative things, we have to get prepared to do without the old paradigm. So I'm just so happy that you stood up for yourself and you're doing what you're doing, Lindsay. I'd love to connect with you again at another time. But thank you so much for your stories. Really moving.
Well, absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. Heartspeakhealth.com and on Instagram and Facebook, Heartspeak Health. Thank you, Lindsay, so much. And for everybody, if you want to see more interviews like this and a bunch more resources, healthrevealed.org. That's healthrevealed.org. Thank you for watching.